What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. Today, I'm going to walk you through the interactive API documentation for the Passport Scorer API.
The interactive API docs are built with OpenAPI, and they give you the ability to test out the endpoints before actually integrating them into your application. In this video, I'm going to walk you through getting an API key, getting a scorer ID, and then give you an overview of all the different endpoints.
After that, I'm going to walk you through all 6 endpoints. We'll start with an overview of all of them, and then we'll go through them one by one. Depending on what you're working on, there's probably only 1 or 2 that you're going to care about. You can watch this video all the way through, or you can use the timestamps down below to skip ahead to the appropriate section. All the links you'll need are in the description box below, including the links to the standard documentation and to the interactive API docs that we'll be going through today. With that, let's go ahead and get started, starting with getting an API key and a scorer ID. The first thing we need to get started is a scorer ID and an API key.
Head on over to scorer.gitcoin.co. That link is in the description below. And sign in with your Ethereum wallet to get started. Now that I'm in the dashboard, I can create my scorer ID and my API key. First, we need a scorer ID. It's a good idea to use a different scorer per application, even if you're going to use the same scoring mechanism. When we create a scorer ID, we want to say what it's for. I'm going to select Other, click Continue. Then we want to give it a name and a description. Once we do that, we need to select a scoring mechanism. For the most part, you're going to select Unique Humanity Score. Stay tuned for a video explaining the different kinds of mechanisms and how in the near future you'll be able to customize and create your own scoring mechanisms. We've got our scoring mechanism. Right here you can see the scorer ID. We're going to need this when we are interacting with the API. Next thing we need to do is create an API key. I'm going to head over to API keys, create a new API key, give it a name, and there we go. Make sure you save this somewhere. There's no way to show the API key again once it's been hidden.
Now that we have the scorer ID and the API key, we can get started working with the interactive docs. The URL is api.scorer.gitcoin.co/docs. That link is in the description below. Before we do anything, we need to authorize with the API. So let's go ahead and do that first.
From the interactive docs, click where it says Authorize. Paste in your API key, then click the second Authorize button. You're now good to go.
Before we dive in, let's take a minute to review all of the endpoints that are available to us.
The first one is for getting a signing message. The second endpoint is for submitting a wallet to be scored. The third endpoint is for getting the score. The fourth endpoint here is for getting every address that you scored using your scorer ID. And the fifth endpoint is for getting all the stamps associated with a given passport. The last endpoint here is for getting all the metadata associated with every stamp in Passport.
That's a brief overview of all of the endpoints and what they're for. In the rest of this video, I'm going to go through and explain each one. I'll explain how to use them, any parameters or data you need to send with your request, and what you can expect back in the response. You can either watch through these one by one, or you can skip ahead to the ones that you care about in the timestamps below. The first endpoint is for getting a signing message with a nonce. If you're using a sign-in with Ethereum Flow already, then this is totally optional. You just want to get some signature from the user that verifies that they do in fact own that wallet, and this is a good one.
If we hit execute, we can see what this looks like. We'll get a message and a nonce. At this point, you'd prompt the user to sign this message in your application.
This next endpoint is for submitting an address to be scored. We have to submit it before we can get a score back for it.
We need to provide the address that we want to be scored, which we do in the request body along with the scorer ID. If we have a signature and a nonce from the previous endpoint, we're going to include those here. But again, if we've already verified that the user owns this wallet in some other way, then we don't need to do that. The response that we get back is going to include the address, the score if there is one, the status, which will most likely be processing, and then a few other things.
Because we've submitted an address, we can now retrieve the score for that address.
This endpoint takes two parameters, the address that we want to score and our scorer ID. We can add both of those into these fields and click execute to get a score. If the API hasn't finished scoring this address, the status field in the response is going to say processing. Otherwise, the status will be done and we'll have the score for this wallet.
This next endpoint gives us all of the scores for all of the addresses that have been scored using your scorer ID.
We're going to pass in the scorer ID and hit execute. That's going to give us back an array of all the addresses that have been scored and each individual address's passport score.
We generally see people using Passport to gate their application with a score threshold, meaning your score has to be above 23 in order for you to be able to sign in. We also see people using Passport to check for specific stamps, usually in addition to a score threshold. So not only do you need a score above 23, you need to hold the Lens stamp or the GitHub stamp. To do that, you'll use the next endpoint, which gives you all of the stamps for a given wallet.
This endpoint lets you pass in an address and get all of the stamps associated with that passport. If I run this, you can see in the response that I get all of the stamps. For instance, here is the Lens stamp. The next endpoint will give you all of the metadata for every stamp. This one will give us all of the metadata for the stamps in this passport if we set include metadata to true. This is helpful if your front end wants to display all of a user's passport stamps. If I run this again and we take a look at the Lens stamp, you can see that I now have this metadata object, which includes the name, description, and icon.
The last endpoint. This one gives you all of the metadata for all of the stamps.
If we run this, you can see in the response that we get back all of the metadata, like the metadata we just saw, but this is for every stamp. The Passport app uses this endpoint to display all of the available stamps that a user could get. Your front end could do something similar.
All right, y'all, that does it for this walkthrough of the interactive API documentation. The links for everything we covered today are in the description below. That includes the Passport documentation and the interactive API documentation. If you haven't already, please join the Passport community on Telegram and reach out there if you're building something cool. Until next time.